Welcome to Affinity Talks Gospel. I'm Lizzie Harewood.
And I'm Graham Nicholls. And we're very glad that you've joined us. And we have a very special guest. We could call them all very special guests, so there's nothing particularly unique. You are a very special guest. And it's Miriam Cates, who was an MP. Welcome, Miriam.
Hello, nice to be with you.
Tell us
I hope we've not insulted you at the outset there.
Well, yeah, I was just thinking that I pretty much introduced everyone by saying that we have a very special guest. And I thought, well, there must be a hierarchy. Perhaps we have to say very, very special guest for some, like Miriam, for example. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Miriam, where you were from originally and kind of what your status is now in life. Anything you want to tell us, really?
Yes, so I was born in Sheffield, in the heart of South Yorkshire. My parents actually moved there, I think, 2 or 3 weeks before I was born. So they're from all over the place, but they've been living in London. So they were new to Sheffield. Grew up there, went to the local comprehensive school, did well at school, went to Cambridge, did genetics, trained to be a teacher. Came back to Sheffield to do that. I got married, had 3 kids, took a career break, and then started getting involved in community life, really, in our village just to the north of Sheffield, the PTA, parish council, things like that. And then when our youngest child, who's now 10, was in the year before school, so his preschool year, I started to think about what I should do next. And I started looking into politics, considering standing for a local election. And to cut a long story short, a family friend asked me to stand as a Conservative for an unwinnable city council seat. I felt it was the right thing to do. I did it, got more involved in politics and became an MP. So that's the kind of potted history. But I had a fantastic, happy childhood. My parents are Christians, long history of faith in my family. My grandparents were missionaries. So very, very blessed with my heritage, really.
Yeah. Just a quick question on the politics. It doesn't sound as though you were like an active, perhaps you were, student or a political person at sixth form college and then at university, or were you?
No, I was interested in politics from around the age of 11, I think. I was given an old radio that only tuned to long wave, and so I was forced to listen to Radio 4. And I listened to the Today programme and Westminster Hour and programmes like that, and got a sense of what our political system was like. I was very interested in the debates in the House of Commons and how ideas became policies and things like that. I wouldn't have called myself party political. I didn't know anybody who was actively involved in politics, but I was certainly very interested in it. But I wasn't involved in student politics at all. And until I was asked to stand for election, I wasn't a member of the Conservative Party.
Wow.
So why did you go down that route in particular then, Miriam?
Well, I always thought that if I was to get involved in politics, God would have to present an opportunity, because, as I said, I didn't know anybody in politics. I wouldn't have even known how to stand for election or how the different parties worked. But when I started exploring it, I assumed that I would join the Labour Party because I lived in Sheffield. I've lived in Sheffield all my life, and it's as red can be. It certainly was at that time. And so I just assumed that to be elected, I would need to join the Labour Party. But I obviously looked into what they believed, and very quickly came to the conclusion that even if I wanted to join, I don't think they would have me. I had very different views. This was during the time of Corbyn's leadership, so obviously different to now. I looked at the Lib Dems, but just didn't feel that was the right thing to do. And then, as I said, I had this opportunity to join the Conservative Party, which I did. I then did, you'll be reassured to know, look into what Conservatives actually believe, and started reading more about Conservative philosophy, and actually found very beneficially that I am actually a Conservative. So fortunately, I did it. It worked out. But I suppose we get hung up on the idea of conservatism as being Thatcherism. Now, I don't think Thatcher was a Conservative. I think she was a radical, certainly economically. I'm not saying that what she did wasn't necessary for its time. Certainly some of it was. But it certainly wasn't conservative. The idea of kind of global economic liberalism, where you just buy from the the cheapest seller, and it doesn't matter where things are made or whether or not your own industry survives. That's not conservative. And I think what's really fascinating about the election of Donald Trump and JD Vance is that they are not economic liberals. They are what you might have called conservative before the 1980s. So I think it's easy to get hung up on Thatcherism and the damage that it undoubtedly did. But to me, that's not what conservatism is. It's about having strong families, strong communities, strong nation, strong cultural heritage. That's what it's about. So I think it's easy to get. Conservatives are not very good at explaining what conservatism is and selling it. But, I think that's something that needs to change.
Well, they often say that it is a very broad church, don't they? Conservatism.
Well, the Conservative Party is too broad a church because it contains both conservatives and liberals, and they disagree fundamentally on quite a lot of things. For example, the role of international law. As a conservative, I think the highest level of human loyalty is the nation. That's certainly the level of democratic accountability. And whilst I do think countries should work together, I don't think international law should actually have any jurisdiction over individual voters' lives. Liberals, on the other hand, think completely differently, and that's the source of the splits and the fights within the Conservative Party.
What was interesting, I don't know if you've read it, but I've been listening to the audiobook of Unleashed by Boris Johnson. And
I haven't read it.
It's really, really interesting. You probably know him well enough to not be so interested, or all the stories. But it's a really good read. He writes well, and he reads his own book well. In a way that's just interesting, just from a pure entertainment point of view. It's interesting. But he talks about the Boris buses, and then the Boris bikes, and he makes the point that the left-wing people, particularly the Labour Party involved in London politics, understand buses because it's all about collectivism. They didn't understand bikes because it's all about individual sort of responsibility. And he does make some very interesting observation. I thought I hadn't really thought about that. Now, I don't know whether you'd call that conservatism, about kind of individual self-reliance and so forth, but he was just saying they just couldn't get their head around the idea because they just like the idea of kind of encasing people in a sort of protective shell and transporting them. That they could understand because it's all about collectivism. But
yeah, wow, I didn't realize we could distill, kind of complex political thought down to whether you ride a bike or. I wonder whether that would work in the Netherlands. So.
Yeah, I don't know. Tell us, Miriam, about your faith, because it's no guarantee that you would be a Christian just because you got missionary family and parents are Christians and all that upbringing. So how did it work for you yourself?
So as I said, very strong Christian family, brought up going to church, being active members of a church, and learning about God, learning about prayer and all the Christian disciplines. And I think I can't remember a time when I didn't believe in God and I didn't believe in that the Bible was true. I think I always have believed that. But I think when it was probably my final year of university, when I really felt God speaking to me saying, if you believe it's true, then it has to be everything. And it's not a hobby like playing football is a hobby, or being interested in art is a hobby. It has to be everything in the foundation of your whole life. And I suppose since then, I've just gone through the process that Christian disciples go through of gradually trying to become more and more like Jesus, to learn more and more about the faith, and live as the Bible says. So I suppose, like a lot of people brought up in Christian families, you go through this process of living through your parents' faith, which of course is absolutely appropriate for children, and then at some point deciding to own it as your own. So I suppose that's my story, really.
And would you say that your faith has had any kind of massive influence on your decision to pursue politics? I mean, you kind of mentioned earlier, you kind of hinted at it, the greatest kind of human authority we have is the nation, I guess, the idea of the nation state. But what about ultimate authority as a human towards something greater? Has that had any impact on your decision to pursue a political career?
Yes, absolutely. And I think because it's very clear, really, that what Jesus requires from us, what God requires from us is first and foremost obedience. We're his children, we're his friends, but at the end of the day, he is God, and he knows what's best for us, and he has a plan. And I've always believed that not that at all that God's trying to control us, but that actually, if we surrender our own plans to his and try and hear what he's saying and how the Holy Spirit's trying to guide us, then that is the best thing we could possibly do. And I very strongly did feel that God was leading me into politics. I felt it was the right and obedient thing to join the Conservative Party, even though that I didn't know where that would lead. And when I had the opportunity to to essentially apply to become an MP, I prayed about that very seriously, and again felt that was the right opportunity. And I think that there are Christians in all political parties, and we want Christians in all political parties, because if you listen to Jesus's parables about being the salt of the earth, in every single human organization you can think of, we want Christians to be there because we know they can have a great influence. But I felt like the opportunity for me was in the Conservative Party, and I first and foremost joined because I believe that was what God was saying, not because I personally had a plan to do that. And I think that's what that's how I've tried to act throughout my time in politics. It is about what is God saying. It doesn't. Yes, I have some sort of loyalty to my constituents. Yes, I need to honour what the whips are telling me to do. Yes, I need to be aware of what journalists are saying. But ultimately, we work for the Lord, and that has guided me, and what the kind of issues that I've become involved in, and what I have and haven't done. So yes, absolutely, as a Christian, we are first and foremost citizens of the kingdom of heaven, and that is the highest level of spiritual authority.
Well, is there a reason you particularly you can define conservatism however you want, because you're in control of this conversation now, but defining it however you want, is there a reason you became that rather than something else? Or was it a spiritual reason, accepting that you might not be right, but was it a spiritual reason, or was it more I think these economic aspects work better? Because that's more of a sort of judgment call, isn't it? As to
yeah, I mean, economics isn't an exact science. So I suppose this is what I think of as conservatism. So I think a better word is actually orthodox, rather than conservative. So I believe in the Judeo-Christian foundation of Western civilization, the foundation of our civilization on the idea that human beings are made in the image of God, and essentially that the 10 Commandments were given as a good rule for societies in anywhere, in any place, and that those boundaries that God gave to the Israelites are the best possible way of organizing society. For the benefit of all, to make sure that everybody is provided for and protected for, to protect the especially vulnerable, so widows and orphans, if you want to use Old Testament language. And those were the foundations of Western civilization. And so to be conservative in our context, in the British context, is to want to conserve those foundations. And the principal route through which people are protected is the family. And actually, we know from statistics, it's absolutely obvious, undeniable, that the best possible outcomes for children are secured when they're born to married parents. You don't have to be a Christian or religious to be able to see that in the data, in every single way, whether it's economic, health, mental health. Those are the best chances in life. And guess what? It fits with the pattern that the Bible gives us. And then families working together as communities to take responsibility for each other, to love your neighbor, without being interfered with by the state particularly much. Again, that's what creates strong society. Have we seen the breakdown of the church, of membership organizations? We all know that we've lost an awful lot because of that. And then the idea of the nation being distinctive, not better than anybody else's nation, but our own nation, because we were born into it, having a sense of loyalty to the nation as a kind of a tribe of people that have come together to help each other and defend ourselves against external enemies, that being the best way to ensure human flourishing. So that's a very simple explanation of conservatism for me. It's about having strong families, strong communities, and a strong nation, and having the courage to teach each generation what their heritage is, what the civilization is founded on, so that it can be extended into the future. And in terms of economics, I mean, I think, politics gets so hung up on economics, but actually economics and culture are two sides of the same coin. Do you believe that place matters? Well, if you believe that your place matters and that each place has a distinctive identity and that you have a loyalty to your own place, then it matters whether or not your local economy is doing well, and it matters whether or not you have industry that people can work in. And I think the problem with liberal economics, I would say, because both people on the right and left have adhered to it over the last 40, 50 years. It's basically based on debt. It's basically based on the idea that we'll get things as cheap as we can, and if we can't get them, we'll print money. And that's why we've got record inflation. That's why our house prices are really, really high, because we've essentially central banks across the world have just printed money. Now, unfortunately, the whole establishment agrees with that way of doing economics. I don't think it's conservative. I don't think it's left wing. I don't think it's right wing. It's a very modern way of approaching the economy. So, I would be very much more down the actually we should bring back strong economics to our own country. Exactly what JD Vance is planning to do in America. That would be my kind of conservatism, but it's definitely not a neoliberal one.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We could get lost in that entirely, but we're going to talk about some social issue stuff. But
yeah, am I allowed to divert the conversation to have a little focus on an issue that's very close to my heart? Is that permitted, Graham?
Is that to do with teaching, or is that something else?
No, it's certainly to do with teaching.
Okay, we're going to get on to teaching. I just had one little question,
Go
which
on, then.
was just because people would be interested to know your take, Miriam. That view you've just articulated really clearly, and and I was quite interested by it. Is that held by many people in the Conservative Party or MPs?
No, well, it may be in the party, not in Parliament. I think in 2019, in the big realignment election, let's call it, we saw a glimpse from Boris Johnson, actually, and others, of starting to understand the disenchantment of ordinary working class voters, which was that this liberal dream of global economics had not worked for them. The steelworks has closed down. Working class men can't get good jobs anymore. It feels like our national identity is being eroded, and that's something that's incredibly important to people who don't have any other way of getting status. Having a sense of being British is a really important foundation. And Boris spoke to that. He instinctively understood what it meant to be left behind. He used these terms like leveling up that the mainstream media mocked, but that really resonated with people who felt like they'd been left behind by globalism. But of course, the Conservative Party after that forgot to lean into those sentiments that got them elected. But what Trump has done is very much lean into those sentiments to express exactly what those blue collar workers are feeling in terms of being left behind economically, and it's won him the election. And what we've seen in America is that the conservative movement, the Republican Party, has now been completely taken over by what I would call the post-liberals, people who are interested again in the nation state, in prioritizing their own people over other countries. And that is a journey that the Conservative Party in the UK half made in 2019, but has then rode back on, and understandably then lost the 2024 election.
Do they have the guts to go full throttle, though? And do you think Kemi would be the one to take them there?
I don't know. I think because, as I said, a lot of the MPs in Parliament are what I would call liberals, and that's a perfectly sound political position to hold, and it has a long history. Liberalism has a long history, but I don't think that it can compete with Farage's Reform Party amongst that base of voters that I've just spoken about, because it's very clear now from the polls and focus groups and elections what that group of voters want, which is economic and cultural security. And unfortunately, that is the exact thing that liberalism has eroded. So if Kemi Badenoch can bring the Conservative Party back into that space of being conservative and being able to express what those voters are looking for, then yes, I think there's potentially hope, but I think there's a long way to go. And I think a lot of conservatives haven't really woken up yet to the global trends in politics, well, the Western trends in politics, because of course we're seeing this. It's not just in America. This is happening across Europe. German government's collapsed today.
Yes,
That's what's coming in Germany.
You could sense that in the biography, to be honest, the Unleashed, that with Boris Johnson, he completely understood the Left Behind thing, and worked it well for Brexit and for other things, but perhaps wasn't either able or willing to follow that through logically to the fact that it does end up, you need to be selfish in a sense, and you need to be slightly less of an internationalist who pleases everybody internationally and never has tariffs or
exactly. And this is, I think, this is what gives Christians moral problems. Is as Christians, obviously, we are taught to be selfless and to sacrifice for our neighbours, be generous. And of course, that is absolutely right. And that is certainly what Jesus is saying to individuals about loving your neighbour and about giving and all those things. But we also, the Bible is clear that we should carry our own load and that we should take responsibility for the things that God has given us responsibility for. Now, just because I love my own children more than I love anybody else's children, and just because I choose to provide for them first before feeding any other children, doesn't make me selfish. That is my responsibility. I am their mother. They have no other mother. If me and my husband don't look after them, nobody will. And I think the same applies to a nation. A government's first responsibility is to look after its own citizens. It's not saying that citizens in other countries are somehow worth less. It's saying that this is our responsibility. And actually, if everybody takes responsibility for their own lives, however small that is or however great that is, then actually everybody get looked after. And I don't think there is a moral conflict between being individually self-sacrificial and taking responsibility for the people, the things, the tasks that we have and nobody else has. And that's why I believe in the nation. Again, our first loyalty is to God. But I think, Jesus talks about the nations. The nation is fundamentally a biblical concept. God created the nation of Israel, gave them an identity, and it was an exclusive identity. And it wasn't that you don't have to think anybody else is less valuable, but just it's your responsibility is to your own people. And when you get a situation where we are buying goods from China and building the Chinese economy whilst destroying our own steel industry, we can no longer make steel. Not only the loss of jobs, but the loss of security. I don't think that is particularly moral. So, I think we, as Christians, we need to kind of rethink, what are governments for? What are individuals for? They don't necessarily have the same roles.
And I think there's something to be said about the US in that, although evangelicalism has a slightly different nuance there, there are many Christians or many candidates who ride on the kind of the Christian ticket and are generally more aligned with Republican Party. It's not so clear cut in the UK, though, is it? I think it's a lot more divergent. There's a lot, but there's also a different posture, I think, towards politics in the UK. In that church leaders are often very squeamish. Even church members are very squeamish about talking political things. May not be the same case online, but certainly face to face, where perhaps these conversations could be conducted more constructively, it seems to be a bit of a no-no. So what would you say then about encouraging Christians to get engaged in politics? Why should they get involved? Whether they necessarily agree with all of your viewpoints or not, why are we squeamish? And what are the big issues that you think the church should be talking about more?
Well, I think we're squeamish because we don't fundamentally want to disagree with people that we love and like. And I think that is a good sentiment. I don't think vicars from the pulpit should be telling people how to vote. Absolutely not. I don't actually think they should reveal how they vote because they're in a position of influence. I don't think that means they shouldn't tackle topics like, what does the Bible say about abortion or something like that. I don't think it means they shouldn't tackle these theological topics. They should, and they are too squeamish. We are too squeamish about that sometimes. But I do think that which party you vote for, I don't think that is necessarily a reason that Christians should fall out. It really isn't. Because I've voted for every political party there is in the last 25 years. And that's a matter of personal choice. I think sometimes Christians get hung up between their theology and their own culture and politics, and sometimes they say that they're voting for a particular political party for theological reasons, whereas actually it's probably not that deep at all. But I think the problem is that we have become a more polarized society because this whole idea of a homogenous normative culture of Christian values has broken down since the Second World War. And now I'm not saying there was some golden era in the UK where everybody was a Bible believing Christian. Of course not. Lots of people did go to church much more than they do now. Well, that doesn't necessarily meant people had personal faith, but there were societal and cultural norms that pretty much everybody subscribed to, and therefore political differences were reduced to things like, should we have trade tariffs? Should we ban gin on the streets of London? And you don't necessarily have to fall out with somebody because your whole worldview is different over those two things. Whereas now, actually, the clash between left and right really is a fundamental difference of worldview, because we've got progressivism on one hand, which, I would say is very much diverges from the foundations of our culture, and then more conservative views on the other side. So I think people are genuinely afraid of falling out. Many people did fall out over Brexit, for example. Christians fell out over Brexit. But I suppose what I would encourage Christians to do is to really read and study these things, because it's so, we live in a world of mass media where there's just so much information. It's very easy to go down one particular viewpoint without really understanding where it comes from. So I would give the example of the gender stuff as one. On the face of it, as Christians, we're told to be kind. And the idea for modern Christians in the modern liberal world of coming out and saying, no, it's morally wrong to tell a child that they can change gender. Or it's morally wrong to say to a child who thinks that they're a girl, not a boy, no, you're wrong. You're actually a boy. Now, there are some Christians who have subscribed to gender ideology on the basis of kindness, and you could look at this. It is the same reason why the Church of England is going down the route they are on marriage. It feels kind, but actually, is being kind just telling people what they want to hear? Is that what the Bible says, or actually is it the truth that sets us free? And therefore, what is the truth? So I think Christians, like anybody, need to read up on these issues, be sure of what they think, be convinced that it is not in conflict with the Bible, and go from there. But I suppose one thing I would say to Christians is that almost all politicians I know from any political party are in it for the right reasons. They might profoundly disagree, but what's really, really unhelpful as a Christian politician, as a Christian in public life, is when Christians come out and say, that's not a Christian point of view, or you're not a Christian, or how can you say you follow Jesus if you also voted for XYZ? And I think we need to be generous to other Christians and say, I might disagree with you, but I believe that you're doing this from a place of believing that you're obedient. And how do we know who's right and wrong? So I think that would be my advice to Christians.
That's really refreshing.
A break.
It's a very refreshing approach. I wonder, am I allowed now to make this little segue? Because Miriam mentioned gender ideology, gender identity. So obviously, I work for the Association of Christian Teachers, and one of your kind of most notable achievements about the work that you did when you were in Parliament was drawing attention to ideological materials, relationships, and sex education materials in schools, which is a matter close to many Christian teachers' hearts. I wonder, could you just explain a little bit? You've got a background in teaching. What was your experience like in education? And then what led you to pursue the course of action that you did when you called for this inquiry into these relationships and sex education materials?
Well, when I was in teaching, I think I took a career break in 2012 and then 2012, 2013, and haven't taught again since. So the educational landscape has changed a lot since then. And some of the aspects of political correctness, if you like, had started to come into schools back then, but nowhere near compared to the changes that we've seen since then. Of course, that coincides with the rise of social media, and a lot of ideas are spread very quickly because of that. But when I do remember, before I was elected, coming to hear anecdotally about instances amongst people we knew of children who had decided to change gender and been told at school that that was the right thing to do, or counselled by the school counsellor, and seeing the damage that that had done to some families. But I assumed that this was highly unusual. Sheffield, as I said, is a very radically left-wing place. I assumed this was just kind of unique to Sheffield. But when I became an MP and I started working on education issues, people started writing to me from all over the country about what was happening to their children. And I became involved with a number of different support groups of parents who have the most heartbreaking stories of what's happened to their children. And often it started with a teacher or somebody coming into school and celebrating the fact that, as they said it, that some people are born in the wrong bodies and you can choose to be a different gender. And then the next step, anybody who refuses to acknowledge that you're a different gender is then a bigot. And even meeting some parents who've been arrested or referred to social services for refusing to affirm their child in their new gender. And obviously this is a huge safeguarding disaster for so many reasons. Any attempt to separate a child from their parents, any attempt to talk to a child about sexual matters, these are all safeguarding red flags, but also fundamentally undermining truth to children is a really serious issue. And telling a child that there are more than two sexes, when from a biological point of view, is absolutely ridiculous. This idea that somebody has an innate gender identity, that is made up. How do I know what it feels like to be a woman? Because I don't know what it feels like to you to be a woman. I just know what it feels like to be me. And getting confused between biological sex and natural personality variations. And I think as a Christian, Jesus reserves his most serious judgment on people who lead children astray. And he said that it's better to have a millstone tied around your neck, be thrown into the sea, than to lead one of these little ones astray. And the idea that our entire establishment, well, not our entire establishment, but elements of our institutions are collaborating in this leading of children astray, leading to children being mutilated and made infertile for life, leading to the breakdown of families and all sorts of abuse. It's just so morally wrong that I think all of us have got, as Christians and as adults, have a duty to stand up against it, whatever the social cost. And most people don't believe that there are 72 genders, but we've had this Emperor's New Clothes phenomenon, which is just a true tale of human nature, that it's very difficult to go against the crowd if there's a social cost to it. And of course, that's what there is. And you'll know this from education, Lizzie, particularly people working in schools and universities. The social cost of challenging this ideology is huge. And that's why so many people haven't done it. But I had a very privileged position in Parliament where MPs have this protection called parliamentary privilege, where you can say anything you want in the chamber of the House of Commons and nobody can sue you. And only 650 people at one time have that privilege. So I felt very strongly that it was my responsibility to use that on behalf of people who can't speak up for all sorts of reasons without losing their job or their livelihood or being sued. So, I tried to use that platform to represent the parents and the children that had spoken to me. And I think, what's been really interesting about that debate is moved on so much.
Yeah.
In just 3 or 4 years. And what's been so key is people from the left, feminists from the left, like J.K. Rowling, being brave. And it's much harder for people on the left to speak up about these issues. They face much more social cost than people on the right. But the collaboration of people on the left and more traditional conservatives like me, it's been incredible what we've seen in this country, in our mainstream media. There's still a lot left to be done, but we certainly have free speech on this issue now, which is a big change to just a few years ago.
Yeah, Lizzie and I were in a briefing just recently, which was probably half Christians. So it was interesting that the rest of the group were people, I can't name, but anyway, people that were interested in the issue and campaigning on the issue who weren't Christians, or not Christians to my knowledge. So that was interesting. Yeah. That was to do with conversion therapy ban or potential conversion therapy ban, and how best to approach it. I think though at a popular level, it hasn't quite seeped through. And obviously we have views about sexual ethics as well and Christian marriage and so on. And I don't think if there is a sense of winning and losing, I don't think we're winning the battle on that front, in that that's kind of landed as a kind of, well, that's, that is totally acceptable and no one should ever critique that. Whereas I think with transgender, there is more, it's up for debate. People realize it's incoherent. And I guess my prayer is that as that kind of explodes, it kind of might even feed back to the fact that they're all interconnected, actually, because they're all to do with doing the wrong things with your body, basically, that it wasn't designed to do. So yeah.
Yes, this idea that human beings are fungible, and that, so yes, you're right, they're all interconnected. And of course, in some ways, some of this started with more extreme forms of feminism, with women saying that there's no difference between men and women. Now, of course, men and women should be treated equally and have equal protections under the law, but they're not the same. And so the feminists who in the 1980s were saying that men and women are the same are now regretting that, because certain men have now said, fine, I'll be a woman. So yes, you're right, these are interconnected. But I think the really interesting thing about the trans debate is that it's so it smacks you in the face in the way that the other ones don't, because that famous image of the American swimmer, I can't remember his name now, 6'4", standing with two tiny little girls who he'd beaten in a race, or that Scottish rapist in a woman's prison. Those photos say more than 1,000 words. And even if you've never really thought about this very deeply, looking at those photos makes you realize that this is it's just wrong. Whereas those other debates is much, because our culture has been going down that route for so long, it's very difficult to think objectively about them. But I think this is why I do think that at the moment in our current culture, children should not be taught about sexual ethics in schools, because there is no consensus. We are a multicultural society, with people for all sorts of views of what constitutes a good and a bad sexual relationship, or what's whether abortion is right or wrong, whether contraception is right or wrong. There is no consensus view, and therefore anything a school teaches in this is by its nature political. It's not political to teach 2 + 2 is 4, because that is the consensus understanding. It is now political to teach anything about sexual ethics, whether that's Christian, not Christian, atheist. It is contentious. And so in a multicultural, multi-faith country, I don't think it's right anymore for schools representing the state to teach about sexual ethics, which essentially is what RSE is.
Yeah.
So sorry, do you mind if I just butt in there? So obviously under the last parliament, there was some draft guidance that was released by for schools on teaching RSE, and also on how to deal with gender questioning children. Would you say then that even that guidance didn't go far enough? Because I know there have been critical voices about that, suggesting that actually it just needs to be completely struck off curriculum altogether. Would you be in that camp then? Because many teachers really welcomed how kind of small c conservative this was.
Yes.
And the age restrictions. And at ACT, we were broadly happy with what the previous government delivered.
No, I think it was a good step forward, absolutely. And I don't think we're ever going to win these battles comprehensively or in one stage. So I think it was a real step forward, and it got people thinking about that some of these things were not appropriate for children's age and stage. Certainly drew a line in the sand about whether or not gender ideology was a respectable viewpoint. So yes, absolutely, they were a big step forward, and it's very disappointing that the new government has overridden those, although very predictable. I think with the gender questioning guidance, yes, that was an improvement, but I think the problem was that it didn't take the use of cross-sex pronouns seriously enough. Now, I think some people thought that the pronouns was the icing on the cake. So, okay, as long as you don't let children actually change sex or actually have medication, or you actively hide it from parents, it doesn't really matter whether you call them he or she, and you might as well do what they ask. Well, I would actually see it the other way around, because language is the great enabler of everything else. And if you call a boy she, then you are you are proliferating this lie that you can then change sex, and that's very dangerous in front of children. Again, it's the emperor's new clothes thing. Everybody knows it's a boy, so why are you saying her? And then that decreases the child's authority in the adult, and then you erode collective adult authority, which is again a really, really bad thing for children. So I actually think that the language is the key to this, and then everything else flows from it. But nevertheless, it was an important step forward. And again, it's very disappointing that the current Labour government have jettisoned it.
Yeah. Did you, Miriam, get any abuse ever for your views, or people nasty to you in person or on social media, or
not so much on in person, well, with the odd exception, but yes, definitely on social media and in the mainstream media. I mean, The Guardian, well, I quite like when The Guardian up now, actually, but The Guardian aren't very nice about me. I think what you completely expect a fight over these issues. They're so contentious. There are people who are very invested in it on both sides, and it's quite many times viewed clip of the former Labour MP Lloyd Russell Moyle shouting at me in the House of Commons. And that made great drama, and actually it was very helpful because it perfectly illustrated the problem of men not letting women speak about their experience of single-sex spaces. So it was very helpful. But I think what surprised me more is on other issues where the attack has really come. So particularly the issue of whether or not women, mothers, should be able to choose to look after their own children in the first 2 or 3 years of life. And that has actually proved to be the most controversial, bizarrely, debate that I have been involved in. And what was interesting about that is that the attack came from the right as much as the left. So I think if you're a conservative politician, you expect the likes of The Guardian and Observer to not like you very much. But when publications like The Times are so critical of what is basic conservative thinking, which is mother and baby have a very strong bond, it's a good idea not to break that. That I did find that very surprising, actually.
So you wouldn't be super in favour of preschool, from sort of 0 to 2 funding?
No, I'm not. And I was absolutely opposed and devastated, actually, when the last government introduced funding for 9-month-olds to be separated from their mothers for 30 hours a day. Now, there is a separate issue of can families survive on one income, which the answer to that is no, not anymore. And that is a massive and detrimental change. But the problem is that families can't survive on one income, not that little children should be in nursery care from a very young age. And I think we just have to look at the science in this and our own common sense, which is that a 9-month-old is not the same as a 3-year-old. And there is plenty of evidence that actually good preschool for 3-year-olds for 15 to 30 hours a week can be beneficial. Absolutely is beneficial, helps them to prepare for school, as long as it's good quality, they have good relationships, everything like that. It's good. But 9 months old are not the same as 3 years old, and all the evidence we have suggests that high levels of institutional care for under 2s is detrimental. And that's what the evidence, and it's obvious really, because for the first year or 2 of a child's life, its mother is, or its primary carer is everything, and being separated from the primary carer can be a grief. And you can read experts like Erica Commissar on this. There's a lot of evidence now for attachment theory, and of course it's what most women don't actually want to be separated from their infants for long periods of time. It's the preference of most women to spend more time at home with their children when their children are young. Now, that doesn't mean women never ever want to go back to work. Actually, they do, absolutely. But it's just those first 2 or 3 years that are so important. And I do wonder, and certainly this is a theory that somebody like Erica Commissar would put forward, if the huge rise we've seen in things like ADHD and behavioural problems aren't at least in part a result of putting children in institutional care before they're ready, and separating them from their mother, and then having them in a context where they're competing with other children for adult attention. I think fundamentally, as a conservative and as a scientist, it's a bad idea. But we're so wedded to our economic model of more GDP, more GDP, or more GDP, that actually the child's interest and even the mother's interest now comes secondary to whether or not there's an extra body in the workplace.
Another issue, sorry, I just wanted to segue off that again. The other issue you've talked quite a lot about in recent months, Miriam, is that of fertility. And of course, it hit the news this week that or was it last week, that for the first time, our fertility rate has fallen below death rate. So, and I know you've had the backlash against raising this, although this is something that is starting to hit mainstream media rather than be one of those kind of niche, slightly more kind of odd right-wing fixations.
Yes, that's right.
Ultra right-wing. So why is that? Is there any particular biblical mandate on that kind of issue? I mean, because I think for many Christians, that would be quite hard.
Well, one of the first commands is in Genesis is to go and fill and subdue the earth. If that's not a mandate to have children, I don't know what is. And the Bible is full of references to children, and actually a sign of being blessed in Old Testament terms was having lots of children. That's certainly very clear from this. It's what people pray for. It's what they want. Fertility was the sign of success, because of course that is what enables you to pass on your values and your faith to the next generation. And I think the world has obviously changed a lot since the Jews of the Old Testament, but nevertheless God hasn't changed, and having children is and remains one of the biggest blessings that there is in life, and it's our connection with the next generation. And I think actually attack on fertility in terms of, and so by fertility what I'm talking about is how many children the average woman has, not are people physically able to conceive. So obviously some people struggle biologically with fertility. That's a different issue. We're talking about how many babies does the country or the world have. And I think actually the attack on fertility, this idea that children are a choice, not a blessing, that children are a burden, not a blessing, which is a very modern idea, or that you should have a child only if you can afford it, a bit like you should only buy a Porsche if you can afford to maintain it. This privatization of the family, of children as a personal choice, not a civilization or community blessing, I think is very contrary actually to what the Bible says. And, I think there will always be people who can't or don't want to have children. And that's absolutely to be expected and respected. But certainly in the past, most people did think that having children was the right thing to do for their own security, for their own joy, and for the good of their community and their nation. And what's really interesting is the only country in the West now with an above replacement birth rate is Israel. And it isn't just because of the Orthodox Jewish community. Secular Jews also have 3 or more children on average. And you've got to wonder if that's because they have this sense of duty to their nation to have more children in order to keep the nation going, which is obviously something that in the West we've very much lost. So, and if you think about the consequences of not having children or not having enough children, they're absolutely catastrophic, because you need about 1 baby for every 50-year-old in order to have a stable population. So you've got enough people coming into the workplace to pay for those who retire. And yet we're now about 200,000 babies short every year just for that basic population stability. And the reason that we are in so much debt as a country, the reason we have high taxes, the reason we've had inflation is because we don't have enough workers in the workplace to support the people who are retired. So from a basic economic perspective, it's very difficult to see how our economy as it is will survive without more babies. But from a biological perspective, the most natural thing to want to do is to reproduce. It's what we see in the whole of the animal kingdom. And the fact that now lots of people don't want to or can't is a question that we should be asking why that's.
Yeah. It's also related, I think, to abandoning the idea of committed relationship of marriage in young life. So people get married later and they want to pursue a career for a good decade before
that's
they have
certainly
children.
true in many countries in the West, but this is now a global phenomenon, and there are only, by the end of this century, there will only be 3 countries in the whole world that have an above replacement birth rate. And what's really odd is in countries like South Korea, where they do have a high marriage rate and very, very little birth outside of marriage, they've still got a collapsed birth rate. So there's something culture. You're right. The biggest indicator of fertility in the West is, do you get married and at what age do you get married? That's absolutely true. But this is now a global phenomenon that makes you think there's something cultural going on.
So
That
what's happening in South Korea? They're pursuing
South
a
Korea, the
career
birth
first?
rate is the fertility rate is 0.7 children per woman. I mean, Korea is probably finished. South Korea is probably finished as a nation because you cannot come back from that. I think 100 people in Korea today are only going to have 16 great grandchildren between them or something like that.
Well,
I mean,
are they thinking I need to pursue my career and children are inconvenience, or are they worried about global population growth?
No, they're not worried about global population. And South Korea, so how have they got into this mess? I mean, there's a number of reasons. Firstly, they are very, very low immigration. They don't like immigration, a bit like Japan. So they've prioritized what you might call ethnic continuity over population dynamism.
Yeah.
And I would say that whilst high levels of immigration have masked Britain's problem in this area, it won't do for much longer because nowhere's going to have spare young people soon. So even if you did support mass immigration politically, it's not going to happen in the future. But also in South Korea, they have quite a difference in the number of men and women because of sex selective abortions. So there aren't enough young women to go around. They also they're quite gender unequal. So although women do have careers and earn a lot of money, they're still expected to do everything domestic. So that's not a good combination. And they have this very this culture of achievement. So your parents will only have one child so they can put every single resource they have into that child, private education, music lessons, all that kind of stuff. And it's the same it's similar in China, who also has a collapsing birth rate. So there's no one answer as to why, every country has different context. But what's so fascinating is now, apart from a handful of countries in sub-Saharan Africa, no matter how rich or poor a country is now, birth rates are falling rapidly, which is a really interesting theological question as well as a economic one.
Right. What I'm going to Lizzie, you can throw one more teacher question in if you have one, and then I'm going to ask Miriam some sort of wrap up questions to do with.
Great, because we are probably getting towards the end of our time. Miriam's been very generous. I guess I would just say, you've had a lot of experience looking into the state of education in the UK, your time on the Education Select Committee, your work revealing the RSC debacle. What are your hopes and prayers for the future of education in our country? We're going to be the government is doing a massive curriculum dissection. And what do you hope and pray will come out of that? What are your fears, but also what are your hopes?
Well, I'm not very optimistic about the government's curriculum review because I was just reading the paper this morning. Clearly, there's a political motivation to move away from knowledge into what people would call well-being, which I think is a big mistake. The whole point of education is to teach knowledge. It's up to children what they then do with it. But, again, teaching something like well-being is just, there is no, what is well-being? Nobody's an expert in well-being. There is no knowledge base in well-being. And therefore, what are you actually teaching children and why? So I'm not optimistic.
Is that what you're thinking? Are you thinking it could be a bit of a Trojan horse?
Well, absolutely. But it's also a dumbing down. And I do think that, we certainly shouldn't have an education system that values the academic above all else. Absolutely not. But we should be teaching children actual knowledge that they can then use later in life, rather than concepts, political ideas, well-being that is just a fad, and we will look back on in 50 years time and think that it was a waste of time. So what I would really love to see in education is more diversification into the practical, technical and vocational from the age of 14, because it struck me as a teacher and now as a mother that it's very clear by the age of 13 or 14, on the cusp of adulthood, that it's very clear where children's talents and interests lie. And for some, that will be academic, that they are our future researchers, lecturers, teachers. But for some, it'd be very clear that their talents and their ambitions lie in learning vocational skills, in becoming a plumber, in becoming a bricklayer, becoming, a hairdresser, or learning to manage a business. And seems to me insane that we expect particularly teenage boys to sit through another 4 years of formal education when they clearly don't want to do it and could actually be earning money and taking responsibility elsewhere. And I think one of the biggest problems we've got in education at the moment is that it only values the academic and the those paper qualifications, and that's what's leaving so many children behind, and it's causing big problems for our economy because we have a shortage of plumbers and welders and engineers, and far too many graduates in degrees that aren't actually worth anything and haven't taught any skills and have just given somebody debt and expectation that can't be met. So I'm really interested in what Andy Burnham's doing in Manchester with this Manchester Baccalaureate, where they do have this kind of diversification from the age of 14, which is what they do in a lot of European countries. And I think if we did something like that, teach a classical curriculum up to the age of 14, maths, science, English, history, a basic grounding in the kind of knowledge you need for life and to understand what our heritage is. But then allow much more choice and to give equal status to the different routes after 14. I think it'd be transformative for boys, particularly who are biologically ready at the age of 14 or 15 to go out and learn how to be a man rather than to sit in a classroom and be told, a few theories for the next few years. So I would think that would transform our education system for kids, especially poorer children.
Oh, it's really interesting. Do you know what? We could go on for quite a lot longer. We haven't even talked about social media and smartphones and all those kind of issues, which I know you also have views on, but we haven't got time for that. What I would say is you sound to me like someone who should be heard. And so what are you doing to kind of, I don't know, to help inform the church, but also I know you're doing some work with GB News and perhaps in other places, but are you going to go back into politics? What do you think you should be doing now with this kind of accumulated knowledge and experience that you've got? How are you going to use it?
Well, I've been incredibly blessed because obviously I lost my job very publicly in July, but I'm now working for GB News. I'll be doing 4 or 5 shows a week. And I suppose what I hadn't appreciated before is how much influence presenters have on the program. So we do get to help decide what topics are covered and how they're covered. So and GB News is going from strength to strength in terms of viewership, regularly beating the BBC and Sky. So it is a really interesting platform that I'm really excited about being part of. It's really fun learning a new skill. It's totally different presenting to being interviewed. It's a lot more nerve-wracking. You've obviously got you're responsible for a lot more. But it's an amazing opportunity to kind of keep pushing into some of the issues that I've got to know a little bit about over the last few years. And I'm also working for the Centre for Social Justice, which is a think tank that Ian Duncan Smith set up 20 years ago now, actually, leading a project on about boys and men and young men and how we can help them to have a better start in life, really. So I've been incredibly fortunate that I have still have the opportunity to work on and hopefully give a platform to some of these issues. And I'm involved with the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, which is the movement, the conference that started last year with John Peterson. That's coming again in February, so I'm involved with that. So and I'm kind of writing regularly for the Telegraph and the Critic and things. So I've been very fortunate to keep a platform, and I feel that's the right thing to do for now. I don't know about going back into politics. I'm not sure. I don't hopefully have to make that decision right now. So we'll see. But I've got enough to do.
Yeah, no, it sounds like it. I've been on GB News quite often, and I would say they're one of the nicest shows to ever go on, because it's not like they actually agree with Christians all the time. You know, I've been interviewed by a number of people who clearly aren't Christians, and some of them would have completely different moral view to me, but they're pretty sympathetic and even-handed, I would say.
Yeah,
that's been my experience. I wouldn't say they're entirely soft. They're not like going on a Christian show where they just just keep bowling you softballs.
You get a fair hearing.
Yeah, I would say.
Also, I've found everybody very kind and nice and just relaxed to work with, which I think has been really, there's a fun feel there, which is
it obviously gets a bit of a bad rap because it's I don't know, it's considered
it gets a bad rap in the mainstream media, but as we've seen in America, the mainstream media is not the future.
Well, indeed, but I've observed Christians who, I say, I've got an interview on GB News, tomorrow morning or whatever, and certain Christians would think, oh, that's brilliant, and another set of Christians would think, oh, that's terrible. What are you doing on there for?
Yeah. I think that's an example of what I was saying earlier about, I think sometimes Christians think that their political views or impulses are because of their faith, but actually they're just because of their culture, like anybody else. And you'll get churches full of people who voted Remain in 2016 and churches full of people who voted Brexit. And actually it's much more to do with their local culture than it is to do with theology.
Yeah. Last question then. Anything particular we could pray for you? Our listeners could pray if they think of you.
And also, how can we pray for Christians in Parliament? Christians, who are MPs.
I think, but pray for Christians in public life. Generally, I think for protection, physical and spiritual, for collaboration. So it's an amazing thing to work with other Christians. I really loved that aspect of Parliament. People from all different spiritual backgrounds. Catholics, Protestants, evangelical. That is a really wonderful thing. So pray for better connections, especially between parties as well. There is some cross-party working, but it would be amazing if there was more. And then I think for courage, really, because it can be hard to speak up on some of these issues. And there are some amazing organizations out there that resource Christians in Parliament, like the Christian Institute, for example. There are those resources, but I suppose, courage to speak up and wisdom to know when and what to say. And then practical encouragement. I mean, it's really, really helpful when you get cards and emails from Christians saying, I'm praying for you, thanks for standing up. It sounds like a small thing, but actually it's really meaningful. So I know, I'm terrible at, I always think, I should send a card to this person and I never get around to it. I'm terrible at doing this, but it is so meaningful when people do it. So if you know a Christian politician or you just write to them in Parliament, it does make a really big difference. And then for me personally, just, I suppose, just the usual, that God would show me what he wants me to do next and that I would be faithful to that. And
for your family
and my family.
Brilliant.
Thank you, Miriam. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you here with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
No worries. Lovely to speak to you. Thanks.
Thank you so much for listening to Affinity Talks Gospel podcast. Affinity is a network of evangelical churches and Christian organizations working together, sharing stories in order to encourage and equip God's people to preach and live the gospel in this generation. If you're interested in supporting this ministry, we'd love you to join us. Just head over to affinity.org.uk/join to find out more. And we look forward to catching up with you on the next episode of Affinity Talks Gospel